This episode of Unregistered is sponsored by HelloFresh. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. I've never been in the military. My father was in the Army, but between the Korean and Vietnam Wars, so he didn't go to war. My stepfather dodged the draft during Vietnam. No one I knew growing up in Berkeley was in the military. The only relatives I know of who were in a war were my granduncles, my grandmother's brothers, who flew bombing missions over Germany. So I have no experience at all with being in a war. I've never seen a war. I've never heard a war. I've never been anywhere near one. The closest I've ever come to being at war was one day I was on the beach near Savannah, Georgia, and there's an Air Force base near Savannah. And as I was walking along the beach, suddenly this noise happened over me that I had never heard before, never felt before. It was the most horrifying, overwhelming noise I'd ever heard in my life. And I looked up and a fighter jet, maybe it was a bomber, I don't know. It was some big military jet, flew seemingly right over my head. And the power of it, the terror that it brought to me. And I didn't have time to think, oh, I'm anti-war, so I must hate this noise. It just was this fundamental, visceral response to that sound that I had never heard, still haven't heard anything like it. So I can only imagine what it's like to hear those jets and to know that they're dropping bombs where you are. I often feel corny and embarrassed that I care so much about foreign wars, about war in general, and about the United States' wars. And often I feel very, very alone about this. But for whatever reason, even though I've never experienced a war firsthand, I just do. And so this week I had to do something. Last week we were scrambling, trying to set up appointments with guests to interview people in person and organizing travel and studio arrangements. And I realized that I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do something different with the podcast this week because I just had to. It's something I wanted to do for a while, ever since I heard about what was happening in Yemen. So I had to call Scott Horton. Now, if you don't already know, you're going to find out a lot about what's going on in Yemen. Scott and I talk about the Yemen crisis, the Yemen war, and what we both believe is the American war in Yemen. We also talk about the history of the United States in the Middle East. We talk a little bit about the history of the United States in World War II. We talk about the state of Israel. We differ on some things. We have a few disagreements in this episode, which I love. Now, if you listen to this episode and you want to do something, and I certainly understand that feeling, you want to do something to stop the war in Yemen, you can write to your congressman. Currently, there is no bill in the House or the Senate regarding Yemen, but you can still call your congressman. And sometimes that actually is effective. You can march in the streets. And I know, as a historian, that has certainly been effective at times in American history, although I wonder sometimes just how effective it was, even during Vietnam. But I'm not opposed to that. I marched in the streets several years ago when Obama was considering whether to bomb Syria, and we were successful. I say we, I mean the people who opposed that idea, were successful in stopping him. And I think the marches in the streets, which were significant, were a part of that. So by all means, if you think that writing your congressperson or marching in the streets will stop the war in Yemen, please do that. I happen to think that the most important thing you can do, though, is to listen to this episode, to learn about Yemen, to learn about American foreign policy, to go look at a map. Go look at a map, open Google Maps and look at where Yemen is. Americans know nothing about American foreign policy, about geography, about where things are in the world. Of the few Americans who do know those things, they tend to be the ones who make the big decisions that affect lots of people's lives and take a lot of people's lives. God knows how many people have ever heard of Yemen, even now, even though it's in the news every day. So the best thing I think you can do is simply learn, educate yourself. Read that article in the New York Times, which is remarkable that he and I talk about. But that's how we're going to change the law. That's how we're going to change foreign policy. That's how we end wars. It's the only way. The fact is that more than 90% of Americans know nothing about American foreign policy. They have no idea that we are at war in Yemen, that we are at war anywhere in the world, really. So listen, learn, and talk. Listen, learn, and talk. It's much more important, I think, and more effective, ultimately, than marching in the streets. The other thing you can do is take Scott's webinar with Renegade University, which he's giving on Wednesday, January 3rd next year. It's at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's called Afghanistan, America's Longest Foreign War. Scott is the first guest lecturer or adjunct faculty for Renegade University, and I'm very proud of this for a lot of reasons. One is which Scott Horton is right now, I believe, the world's leading expert on the war in Afghanistan. He just wrote what I think is the definitive book on the Afghanistan war. And by the way, if you look at the blurbs for the book, you'll see that many, many other experts agree with me on that. His book is called Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan. And we talked about it the last time he was on the show. But take Scott's webinar. And take my webinar, which I'm giving tonight, Wednesday, December 6th at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's called World War II, The Great Blowback. You can register for both webinars at my website, thaddeusrussell.com/courses. In the meantime, here's my conversation I recorded yesterday with Scott, the day when the former president of Yemen was assassinated. Look, normally, as everyone knows who listens to this show, I do one-on-one in-person interviews, but when there's an emergency in the world or something that I think is an emergency, I break protocol, or at least this is the first time I'm doing it, but I thought it was really important given what's going on in Yemen. I had to call Scott Horton this week and talk about what's happening over there because, normally Americans don't know anything about foreign policy or very little about it, and in this case, they know even less, but there are a lot of people dying in a country that Americans have never heard of. And Scott and I and some other people think that a lot of that has to do with the United States of America and our tax money going to particular purposes. So, Scott, thanks for joining me. And just give us a brief sort of overview of what's going on in Yemen from your perspective. And, a lot of people will be listening who won't have sort of an expert's analysis of this. So, for the layperson, the civilian, what's the best way to understand what's going on in Yemen right now?
Well, it's an attempted regime change by Saudi Arabia and the United States to reinstall the last puppet that they installed who was driven out of power. It really didn't take. And they're trying to basically force that regime change again. And it's not working. It's been 2.5 years. This is the major crisis there. Of course, America's been bombing Yemen in the name of al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula and all that for a lot longer than that. But this is the war for al-Qaeda against their enemies, the Houthis, from out of the north. And so then the big news today is the former dictator who used to be enemies with the Houthis, but then has allied with them since he was thrown out of power in the Arab Spring and with American help. Their alliance is now completely broken because he tried to stab those Houthis in the back and tilt back toward the Saudis and get his old job back. And when he did that, the Houthis killed him. I woke up this morning to pictures of him lynched, murdered in the back of a pickup truck, Gaddafi style. So much for that. And it's a complicated mess. I mean, if you want me to really go back a few years and try to go step-by-step chronology or that kind of thing, we can do that. But
yeah, let's do that. So first of all,
the long and the short of it is, it's a brutal war, and the I'm not taking sides on any sides here other than to say that the Americans and the Saudis are the worst aggressors, but the only good guys in the thing are the innocent civilians who are caught in the middle.
Right. So let's just do the numbers. I mean, how many people have died? Of what causes and who and where?
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I think when we find out the excess death rate and so forth, I think we're going to find that hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people have died in the last 2.5 years from the deprivation from this war. And the official count, according to the UN, is 10,000, but That was half a year ago or more. And at the time, a journalist that I know in Yemen named Nasser Arabi, he had confronted the UN representative and said, how can you say it's 10,000? It's so much more than 10,000. I have my own body counts from the morgues and et cetera that I've been tallying. And he said, oh, yeah, no, you're right. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I know it's 10,000. It could be a lot higher. And I think it's very likely that it's much higher because the Saudis have waged a pretty relentless air campaign against their civilian infrastructure. Against their, like Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush in Iraq, bombing their sewage and their water works and their electricity and all these kinds of things. The Saudis took the central bank and moved it to the southern port city of Aden so that now all the civil servants that work in the north, all the garbage men and all those people were unpaid. So that has helped lead to the cholera crisis there. As all the civilian infrastructure broke down. And the cholera epidemic right now is the worst cholera epidemic in recorded history. It's right around 900,000 to 1 million people have cholera right now. And I don't know what is the percent of them that are dying of it, but it must be a considerable percent. And of course, it's the youngest who are the most susceptible. And the thing is about cholera is it's such a preventable disease. You don't even really need antibiotics. You just need fluids. You need lots of fluids because of the diarrhea and the vomiting. You'll dehydrate to death. That's what these babies are doing. They're dehydrating to death. And all they need is a saline drip, right? Except their country is in total chaos. And so they can't get one.
Yeah.
And when I talked to Claire Monera from Doctors Without Borders last spring, she said, yeah, it's about 30,000. And then I talked to her in June, and she's like, yeah, no, it's about 70,000. And then I talked to her in, I think, late August, early September, and she's like, yeah, no, it's more like 500,000 now. And now the Red Cross is saying it's right around 1 million people, 900,000 to 1 million people have cholera. And now they have diphtheria breaking out. All of this preventable, all of this directly as the result of what they call the Saudi war. That is really, entirely the responsibility of the USA.
Yeah. So in terms of the numbers, I mean, what would you say to someone who would say, well, these humanitarian organizations, it's in their own self-interest to inflate these numbers?
Well, they don't seem like they are. I mean, it seems to me like everybody, they've been through that. And if anything, they lowball all these estimates because they don't want to be caught exaggerating because the truth is horrible enough. There's no point in exaggerating. But here's a country that was already the poorest country in the Middle East, who, as Martha Mundy has explained, she's an expert from I forget which university in Great Britain, talked about how the IMF and the World Bank had previously gangsterized them out of all of their sorghum and their traditional domestic crops that they used to feed their population, and had got them to instead grow, focus more on coffee and other crops that they can sell on the world market, which is fine, and they were importing their food. It changed their entire economy to the point where they were importing between 80 and 90% of their food. Well, which is great, fine, whatever. Global markets work fine until the USA puts a blockade on you.
There you go.
And now you can't eat your coffee, so it'll get you up in the morning, but who's going to get you through lunchtime?
Right. So I think a lot of people don't know this, that the main cause of the famine and the cholera, I guess, well, certainly the famine is the blockade, which was established by Saudi Arabia in 2015, right?
Right, and by Barack Obama, by the U.S. Navy.
Yes. So they can't really, is this right? The Saudi Navy can't by itself really enforce the blockade effectively without the U.S. Navy helping?
Well, I don't know. Right? I mean, the Yemenis don't have a navy of their own to fight back with. So I don't know to what degree they really need U.S. support, but they certainly have it.
Right, but I would imagine smugglers, bootleggers could probably get in through just a Saudi blockade. It's a long
I mean, if you phrase it the other way, like, hey, is the blockade more effective with American help? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's well, we know this is true, right? We do know that the U.S. Navy is there, at least on standby, to enforce it.
Yeah, and they have seized boats. I mean, this is part of the smear campaign against Iran is that, we seized these boats with guns on them, so therefore it must be Iran arming the Houthis. But as Gareth Porter has shown repeatedly, that no, that's all blown out of proportion. One of the times they had no guns at all, I think it was, and the other time they had a bunch of AK-47s, but there was no reason to believe the ship was coming from Iran in the first place, and there was plenty of reason to believe it was headed for Somalia, not Yemen.
Right.
But they can just make whatever claim they want, and that usually sticks.
Right. So we have multiple media reports that the United States Navy and the Saudi Navy working together have stopped ships going in and out of Yemen, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, for 2.5 years,
food.
For 2.5 years, there's been a commercial blockade. What's really made the news lately was they were cutting off, over the last few weeks, even the Red Cross and the last of the aid ships, too, and closed the airport in Sana'a and everything to even the last of the humanitarian aid.
Right. So no food is coming in.
Right. And they're beginning to make some exceptions now. It's that, well, now that Salah's dead, who knows, the whole thing is in flux again.
Right. So a poor country to begin with, which was importing 90% of its food, and then you put a blockade on it, including blockading food shipments, and then famine has to be the result of that, right? So to me, whatever the numbers actually are, I mean, it stands to reason that people are starving. Right. Don't have enough food.
And if people want to quibble, like how many tens of thousands of innocent children are you going to starve to death, before it's now no longer kosher? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well,
I'm talking with Scott Paul from Oxfam, and he's saying, look, a lot of these people, they die of influenza, right? They die of pneumonia, they die of the common cold, they die of all kinds of things that they would never die of, except for the fact that they are already hungry and they're already in this state of deprivation and their infrastructure is ruined. And so that doesn't count as a combat death, but you find out later when you compare the burial rate overall that it's just like in Iraq War 1.5 and in Iraq War 2, you find out this excess death rate is beyond comprehension.
Right. So it's not challenged that the blockade is in effect in part because of the assistance of the U.S. Navy. There's no controversy over whether Yemen was 90% dependent on food imports, right? And so there can't really be an argument that there's famine, there's starvation going on. It's been it's 2.5 years now. So it just, whatever the numbers are, that's an act of war. A blockade of a country, in particular a country that's that dependent on imports, that's an act of war. That's what Churchill understood in World War II when he imposed a blockade on Germany. People had less food, and he knew that. He said it to his generals and admirals, and that was the whole point of it. The whole point of that blockade was to starve the German people into submission.
Right. And I mean, look at what they're doing. Yeah. They're even blocking the Red Cross. They're even blocking, never mind any merchant who would like to sell food, they're blocking international relief organizations. It's a deliberate war of famine. It's a genocide. That's what you call it when you do a famine to someone.
Right. When you make a famine happen, when you deliberately, I looked up the United Nations definition of genocide, and there's no question that what's going on in Yemen is an act of genocide. It's a deliberate attempt to starve people into submission. There's no doubt about that. So let's back up a second. Let's go back to the start of this thing. And you pointed out an amazing New York Times article from March of 2015, which I think kind of says it all as to why the United States is involved here, why they've been supporting this war by Saudi Arabia, which is that it happened in the winter of 2015. The Houthis took control, right, of a big chunk of northern Yemen, which is on the border with Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis were very nervous about this for two reasons. One is that the Houthis sort of historically are hostile to Saudi Arabia, and there's some territorial disputes. And the second is that the Houthis, am I right, are Shia, and therefore potentially allies with Iran. That it could be potentially, in the Saudi mind, in the Washington mind, a place where Iran could establish a foothold. Am I right?
That's right. That's what they claim anyway.
Right. And so the Saudi government in this is according to the New York Times, in March of 2015, went to Washington, went to the White House, met with Obama and John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State, and Samantha Power, who was the ambassador to the UN, and said, we would like to start a war against these people, these Houthis in Yemen who have taken control of part of that country. And according to the New York Times article, and I'll link to it in the show notes, Obama and Kerry and Samantha Power all said, absolutely, not only should you have a war with those people, we will help you by doing what? What were the specific means of assistance the United States gave to the Saudis in waging this war?
Well, first and foremost, the bombs, and then the intelligence to help with the targeting, all the care and feeding of their equipment, including all their jet fighters, and mid-air refueling by the U.S. Air Force. And then I have two rumors, both saying the same thing. It's hearsay, but it's really good hearsay. One is former Ambassador Dan Simpson had a single source, and the great journalist Andrew Coburn as well have both heard that there are literally white boys sitting in the back seats of the Saudi F-15s holding the princelings' little hands all the way to their targets there, at least at some points during this war.
Right.
They have been doing so. So in other words, it's America's war. It's because the Saudis want to do it, right? It's not the Americans' policy first, but it could not possibly be happening without American support.
See, I think it is American policy, and because the Times essentially quotes John Kerry, Secretary of State at the time, as being very concerned about what I talked about, Iran establishing a foothold in Yemen. And if you look at a map, you can understand why an American head of state would be concerned about that, because Yemen sits at the Gulf of Aden, which is the gateway to eventually the Suez Canal. So all the oil that goes from the Persian Gulf to Europe, or most of it at least, goes right past Aden in Yemen. It goes right past that shoreline.
Yeah, but he's still making excuses there because, they know, as Obama himself admitted on TV, you can find the YouTube somewhere, where he says the Iranians told the Houthis not to take the capital city, that would provoke the Saudis into bombing the hell out of them and starting a war. So, and they understand the reality that any honest expert will tell you at any of these think tanks that aren't, the FDD or whatever, they will tell you outright that the Houthis are not Hezbollah. They are not a proxy of the Iranians. For Shia, they're a lot more like Sunni than they are like the 12ers in Iran, and they just don't have that real relationship. They're missiles that are supposedly, Iranian missiles, as Moon of Alabama blog has pointed out. No, that's because Iran and Yemen both bought their missiles from North Korea, not because they're Iranian missiles at all. The whole thing is a hoax, man. And a bunch of basically rationalizing after the fact. And I think something that, I want to quote that New York Times article real quick here, where they say that we have to do this even though the president's advisors were concerned that the offensive would be, quote, long, bloody, and indecisive.
Yeah. That
they needed to do this anyway to placate the Saudis as they were completing the nuclear deal with Iran. So this was not really that, Iran is on the march in Yemen and we're afraid of what they're doing. What it is Obama was taking the threat of war with Iran off the table by making this new nuclear deal that double extra safeguarded and inspected their civilian nuclear program beyond all reason so that it could not be used as an excuse to start a war. Obama the Great for one day. Okay. And then they had to placate the Saudis because the Saudis were worried that this meant that America was now opening up the option of tilting back toward Iran and using, the old Israeli periphery strategy where you back the Turks and the Iranians and all the Arabs neighbors on the outside to keep them divided on two flanks and that kind of thing. And so that if their position in America's order in the Middle East is being threatened, they need a pat on the head. And so in this case, the pat on the head is, go ahead, we'll help you commit a genocide in Yemen. And at the same time, too, I'll point out this piece by Patrick Coburn from the Time. It's called A Young Prince May Cost Syria and Yemen Dear, that he wrote for the Independent. And it's about how the Crown Prince now, then the Deputy Crown Prince and brand new defense minister, that he launched this war for his own public choice theory reasons in his own position of power. He's the very young, at that time, 29-year-old, brand new deputy crown prince and defense minister. The first thing he did was launch a war. And this was all the Saudi, Kremlinologists were saying, see what he's doing here is he's shoring up his own political, capital, basically, by launching this ultimately horrific and failed war, but what was supposed to be Operation Decisive Storm to reinstall the Saudi puppet on the throne in Sana'a and make him look good.
Yeah, so I think you and I might have a little bit of a disagreement here. No one knows what the Ayatollahs in Iran are planning in terms of foreign policy, but we do know, right, that they have allies now all the way across to Lebanon. They have allies in the Iraq government. They have allies in the Syrian government. They have allies in, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon.
The only thing that's different is that America gave them Baghdad. They've been allies with Damascus and with Hezbollah all this time.
Sure, yeah. But, I mean, it's certainly, again, it stands to reason that the Iranian government would want, wouldn't they, friends and allies across the region?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, they're going to pick a fight that is only going to cause them trouble and cost them a lot of money and that they can't win. What do they have to gain from trying to, foist the Houthis on Yemen? Again, they warned the Houthis, don't take the capital city. You have your own autonomy in the north. Be happy with that.
Well,
so where's their agenda to take over Yemen? And show me anyone else other than you who thinks that, who didn't push us into war with Iraq and want war with Iran right now based on this phony excuse of the Persian Empire that they created by knocking off Saddam for them. And not only that, fighting an 8-year civil war to put the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council in power in Baghdad.
Oh, yeah. So, you can be 100% anti-war, which I am, and still have my analysis of this, right?
Yeah, but I'm just saying, where are you getting this stuff from other than Bill Kristol and David Frum? It's nonsense.
No, it's from looking at the map, and it's looking at Iranian history and looking at the ideology of the regime. They have internally and externally talked about exporting the revolution. And, it's a universalist
to Yemen
belief system. Yeah, but also strategically, it makes sense to be surrounded by friends instead of enemies.
Well, it's still all hypothetical, right? There's no evidence of this whatsoever.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a great article, by the way, at Foreign Policy by Joost Hilterman called "The Houthis Are Not Hezbollah," and he makes a compelling case.
Oh, I see no evidence that the Houthis were ever Hezbollah or allied with Iran in any formal or meaningful way. I just think that it's not paranoid on the part of Washington or Riyadh to think that the Houthis are a potential ally of Iran. That's all. I don't think I've seen some scholars call it paranoia on the part of the Saudi government.
I think it's a fake ass excuse. How about that?
Right.
I don't think for a minute that they believe it. I think they're just liars and murderers.
So then what is motivating DC?
Well, they have to placate the Saudis because Obama decided to make the nuclear deal with Iran, to ratchet tensions with Iran down one. So then he had to ratchet friendship with Saudi up one. That's what they said. That New York Times piece that you refer to, that's no James Risen scoop, right? That's a press release from the White House based on 17 National Security Council sources or whatever, right? This is the official story. Well, we wanted to make the Saudis feel better since, we were putting a couple of eggs in another basket for just a second. Well, as though the Iran deal really represented a major sea change in American military posture and American Mideast policy over there whatsoever. When what it really was just what it was. One nuclear deal to take the threat of war off the table, but that's it. It's not like, oh yeah, we're going to open up an embassy in Tehran now.
Right. Sure. So, if you look, though, about halfway down that Times article, as I said, it has basically paraphrasing John Kerry saying what I'm saying, which is that, again, there was a real sort of rational strategic interest there in Yemen. And I just don't think it's irrational or paranoid. I think that John Kerry, it makes perfect sense to me that he would believe that. He's an expansionist. He believes that, Putin's a threat, and that's why we need NATO. And he has always believed that Iran is a threat, and that's why we need allies who are opposed to Iran in that region.
If he does, it's still all his fault.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
No.
Him or his government, Hillary Clinton before him, and Barack Obama, they were the ones who armed and bribed Saleh into fighting 4 wars with the Houthis, that they won all 4 of them and got stronger and stronger the whole time, and that helped to undermine him. And at the same time, why were they bribing him? So that JSOC and CIA could wage a war against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which only grew them more and more powerful, watering a plant in reaction to the drone war. And then so when the Arab Spring came and all sides agreed it was time to get rid of Saleh, when the Americans came in to intervene, basically, and to short-circuit the real revolution and install the vice president, the Saudi favorite Hadi, in there. Well, Saleh had a brand new American armed and financed army to take with him when he left. And he went and he joined up and formed an alliance with his enemies, the Houthis, who are now battle-hardened and ready to fight, who then started their war to take over. So, you know, what they always want to do is truncate the antecedents, as Robert Higgs says, and pretend like, oh, yeah, look, a bad thing. Guess what, everybody? This was Mike Pompeo, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency 2 days ago or 3 days ago. Oh, my God, y'all, look. Iranian power and influence in Iraq has increased. And then he says, just look at the last week. Yeah, don't look at the last 16 years of this, or the last, 14 years, 15 years of America, since America got rid of Saddam for them and fought to put all their men in power. And now they want to say boo-hoo. And then, so this backlash happens in Yemen as a direct consequence. It's not even blowback. It's backdraft. It's when the policy that everybody knows about blows up right in your freaking face. And then you want to go, oh, cry, boo-hoo, Tehran is... That Ayatollah boy, he's up to something under that weird hat of his. Man, I don't know what it is, but I bet. But based on what? You know? And again, they haven't even been proven to sell a single gun to the Houthis this whole time. I mean, Saleh's taken the army that Obama bought him and has used that against the American and Saudi-backed forces this whole time.
Yeah, so I was going to say, you know, truncating the antecedents. I mean, I would take it back 60 years, right, to the overthrow of Mossadegh by the CIA and replacing him with the Shah, which created a massive backlash or blowback, right? That's what created the anti-Americanism in Iran that we love so much today, right? I mean, that was the origin of the revolution of 1979. That whole generation was responding in large part to that coup by the CIA in the 1950s.
And then Carter and Reagan backed Saddam in an 8-year war that killed 500,000 Iranians, including helped them target them with chemical weapons. And then, of course, Saddam's bankruptcy at the end of that war was the reason that he asked James Baker if it would be okay if he invaded Iraq. And James Baker said, Kuwait. And James Baker said, yeah, sure. What the hell do I care? Which was the start of Iraq War I and the permanent occupation of Saudi Arabia. And the rest is history, right?
Yeah. So you don't, I mean, again, no one really knows what the Iranian regime is thinking. I mean, Rouhani makes some statements here and there, but who knows what they actually think. But so you actually see them as purely defensive, that they're not interested in expansion at all in the Middle East?
Well, no. I mean, if you look at what happened in Iraq War II, I think that the Iranians were perfectly happy to help finance the Iraqi National Congress of Iraqi exiles who were telling the Israeli fifth column in Washington, D.C., the neoconservatives, that, oh, yeah, the Iraq war is going to be great for Israel and it's going to really put a lot of pressure on Iran once we get rid of Saddam for them, and that David Wurmser and Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz are stupid idiots, and they were the brilliant geniuses who were telling Bush, oh, yeah, no, we gamed it out. This is going to be great. And so once they did invade Iraq and get rid of Saddam for Iran, then Iran sent... See, when Carter and Reagan backed Saddam's invasion of Iran, part of Saddam's concern was that he was the ruling 20% Sunni dictatorship over the Shiite supermajority. I mean, there are some Shiites in the Ba'ath Party, but they weren't the real rulers of the society. The supermajority were ruled by the minority. So Saddam was really worried that the Iranian Revolution was going to take right over the Shiite south and east of the country. So part of the reason he started the war was to conscript all those Shia and force them to go to war with Iran in the name of Iraqi nationalism and over their secular identity, or their, sectular identity, however you say that. So a lot of them, many of them, chose Iran. They chose the Shiite revolutionary forces. And these were the, quote unquote, Iraqi traitors, the Dawa Party and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution specifically, who fled to Iran And so 30 years later, when George Bush Jr. invaded Iraq and took over Baghdad, they came in on his heels. In fact, they came in 91 when Bush Sr. encouraged the Shia to rise up. And the reason that he betrayed them was because the Iranian-backed militias started coming across the border. And he realized, oops, I'm undoing the entire Reagan-era policy of containing Iran by backing Saddam. Now I'm reversing that. So he stopped and he betrayed them and left them high and dry, Bay of Pigs in the desert, 91. Then 12 years later, his son comes and picks up where he left off and fights the war to install them in power. Now, the the major Shiite factions in Iraq War II, there were really three major factions, and that was the Supreme Islamic Council and the Dawa Party, who had been in Iran for 30 years, and Muqtada al-Sadr and his Mahdi army and associates, who were more Iraqi Arab nationalists and preferred an alliance with the Sunni Arabs and Iraqi nationalism and against sectarianism, and wanted America and Iran out. So America worked to try to marginalize Sadr and instead supported the most Iranian-backed factions of all, the Hakim family, Abdulaziz al-Hakim and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution and his Badr Brigade or Badr Corps death squads. And then America basically carried out Iranian foreign policy in that war and fought that whole civil war for them. The surge of 07 was putting the finishing touches, as at the same time they were fighting against Sadr, they were putting the finishing touches on kicking all the Sunnis out of Baghdad. And, you know, the Americans and the Iranians had an interest in trying to control the future situation there. If there was ever going to be peace, the people of Iraq had to be left to sort it out on their own. And then what Bush thought was that the Iraqis that he put in power would need him more than they needed Iran. But at the end of the day, they didn't. So in 2008, at the end of his presidency, they told him, thanks a lot for giving us all of Baghdad. Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And made him sign the Status of Forces Agreement, agreeing to leave by the end of 2011. So, in other words, Iran's foreign policy in Iraq War II was a horrible, vile, genocidal, sectarian war against the Sunnis, and America helped them accomplish it. That's not saying anything good about them at all, and they're horrible bastards. I'm just saying the only bad things about them that are true are the ones that are true, and all the myth-making is just nonsense. I mean, think about, they spent a decade telling us the Iranians were making nuclear bombs. More than a decade, really. You know, you go back to 1985, they say the Iranians are making nuclear bombs, but especially in the 2000s, since the 2000s, it was never true, not once. I mean, if you drove for a living and listened to the top of the hour AM radio news, you would have thought Iran had 100,000 nuclear bombs by now. They never made one. They never even tried. The whole thing was a giant hoax.
Today's show is brought to you by Away. For $20 off a suitcase, visit awaytravel.com/renegade and use promo code RENEGADE during checkout. Because I live in two places now, and because of this podcast, I travel a lot. In fact, I'm in an airplane almost every single week, so I was pretty thrilled when Away asked to sponsor the show, because I only take sponsors whose products I love. My Away carry-on suitcase is by far the best piece of luggage I've ever owned. It's incredibly lightweight, durable, compact, and smooth rolling. And it fits easily into every overhead rack I've tried to put it in. It makes my really crazy travel schedule much, much easier. Away uses high-quality materials while offering a much lower price compared to other brands by cutting out the middleman and selling directly to you without the retail markup. You can choose from over 10 colors and 5 sizes. There's the carry-on, the bigger carry-on, the medium, the large for extended stays, or the kids carry-on for the smaller travelers among us. Both sizes of the carry-on can charge all cell phones. It's very cool. As well as tablets, e-readers, and anything else that's powered by a USB cord. A single charge of the Away carry-on will charge your iPhone up to 5 times. Right now, Away bags and accessories are the perfect gift. They have a lifetime guarantee and a 100-day trial. So there's a perfect size and color for everyone on your list this holiday season. Or you can grab an Away gift card if you can't make up your mind. So for $20 off a suitcase, visit awaytravel.com/renegade and use promo code RENEGADE during checkout. This episode of Unregistered is sponsored by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that shops, plans, and delivers your favorite step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients so you can just cook, eat, and enjoy. The convenience, selection, and flexibility of HelloFresh are pretty amazing. They offer a wide variety of chef-curated recipes that change every week and deliver the meal kits to your door on the specific days of the week that you choose. All the ingredients come pre-measured in handy labeled meal kits, so there's no confusion and you know exactly which ingredients go with which recipe. HelloFresh makes it so easy to cook delicious, balanced dinners for less than $10 a meal. The thing I hate the most about dinner is having to plan it every single night. With HelloFresh, there's no more time-consuming planning of meals, writing down those lists of ingredients that you need to get, and shopping for groceries. My girlfriend and I just made one of our favorite HelloFresh recipes, roasted pork tenderloin with lemony potatoes and zucchini. It's healthy, it tastes great, and it takes us only half an hour to prepare. For $30 off your first week of HelloFresh, visit HelloFresh.com and enter promo code UNREGISTERED30. That's promo code UNREGISTERED30. Yeah. So I'm just trying to sort of step back, look at the big map, the big picture, and put myself in the mind of someone, again, in Washington. Because I agree with you. They're the ones who created most of this mess. They certainly set the parameters. They set the sort of basic framework for what's been going down for the last 60 years. But so what Washington has very much participated in is the creation of an entire society, meaning the broader Middle East, in which a lot of people who identify as Shia have essentially been oppressed, right, by a Sunni minority, the ruling parties across the region in various forms, usually supported by the United States in big ways, right? And so I see a lot of reason for a Shia Muslim in the Middle East to be anti-American, right? And so the thing is, if you are anti-American and a Shia in that region, the only person to look for, the only place to look for help is Iran. So again, it stands to reason that the people who created this mess should be worried about the mess in that way. They should be worried about their own Frankenstein monster, which is really the Iranian regime, isn't it?
I mean, I guess so, but still only hypothetically. I can see that stands to reason as far as what could or should happen. And again, I'm not trying to, bestow all benevolent motives on them. They're politicians, and not only that, theocrats, which is, I think, the worst kind of politician. I guess there could be other worse kinds, Nazis, but anyway, pretty damn bad. So it's not like, I'm from Texas, man. It's not like I have any reason to favor them. I just think that when 99% of all the accusations against them are false, or at least are severely lacking in context, then, everybody ought to really hold their horses. So, in fact, the two factions that have benefited the most from American foreign policy in the Middle East in the 2000s, under Bush and under Obama, are the Ayatollahs, the mullahs in Iran, and bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Exactly.
Who've gone from this small group of 400 to approximately 40,000 now. I don't know exactly how many the Marines just finished killing, but there's at least probably 10,000 of them loose if you want to be really conservative about it and you want to include Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and North Africa and all this stuff. And, to me, the idea that Iran is a threat to America, no matter how much they've benefited from America's wars for and against their behalf, they've benefited from all of them so far. The same is true of Al-Qaeda, and they actually are the enemies of the American people. I mean, the Iranians have never done anything to us other than declare independence, right? And seize some hostages from the State Department back when I was a toddler, to be very specific about that.
Yeah, I guess so. If you believe in blowback theory, and I generally do, and I certainly do in this case. I mean, I think the Middle East is one giant 60-year-long blowback against the United States from its own interventions. But if you do believe in that, then blowback is a real thing with real consequences for the people who perpetrated it, right? Who began it, meaning the United States. And so that's largely how I explain, and I think it's how you explain.
Yeah, but you're
terrorism.
Conflating the empire and its interests in dominating the Middle East with the interests of the American people. So, in other words, no one thinks that Iran is ever going to fly any buildings into our towers. No one thinks Iran is ever going to build a navy and try to sail it across the Atlantic or anything like that. They're not a threat to us. They're just a threat to American dominance. But just think, the middle part of North America is the dominant power in the Middle East on the other side of the world. It's not supposed to be that way in the first place. So I actually don't care at all what all America has to lose in the Middle East. You know, General, was it Mattis? No, it was Pompeo. That same thing by Pompeo the other day. He was saying, yeah, well, we're not going to let Iran, now that for some reason they have more power and influence in Iraq than ever before, well, we're not going to let them threaten America's interests in Iraq. Well, America doesn't have any right to any interests in Iraq. Only the evil, illegitimate empire does. And I don't care if they lose everything. Seriously, I don't. I want them to.
Yeah, just to be super clear here, you know, my position on this is total withdrawal tomorrow from the Middle East. So, I mean, and I just think that my analysis, and John Kerry's analysis for that matter, actually fits that in some ways better. I mean, in other words, I think that American foreign policy has created much worse problems for the people who live there, but also real problems for Americans. I mean, I do think there is a potential that people who are backed by Iran or who are Iranian themselves could, I don't know, launch a terrorist attack against Americans. That's not conceivable. And in fact, it would be in some ways rational, right? According to blowback theory, Iranians who are Muslims and devout have all the reasons in the world to hate Americans, don't they? And by the way, it's not just the American government, but they know, they're not stupid, that most Americans have been anti-Iranian and anti-Islam for a long, long time. So
yeah, but the Iranian state has no interest in backing terrorist attacks against the American people and bringing a war upon themselves.
It depends on the strategic moment, right? But it could serve their interest for whatever reason. I mean, that's like Bin Laden, right? The same, that was his strategy. He wanted to draw in the United States because he knew they would eventually lose that war.
Right, but of course, he wasn't trying to draw them into Saudi. He was trying to draw them into Afghanistan. I don't think the Iranians are trying to draw us into Iran. You know, they're probably, you know, had plenty of chuckles watching America bogged down, killing and dying for them in Iraq. For a while there in Iraq War II. Oh, and again for the last 3 years in Iraq War III against ISIS, which America had only built up in order to check Iranian power, and we ended up empowering them even more. Again, I'm agreeing with you now that non-interventionism, whether we're talking about, oh, I hate and fear Iran, or, oh, I hate and fear Al-Qaeda. Well, the more we fight against them and the more we fight for them, the more powerful these two enemies of each other get.
Absolutely.
So how about we stop now? How about, as I say in my book about Afghanistan, which, by the way, is called Fool's Errand. It's on sale now. I say, just forget it. Don't tie up loose ends. There is no tie up loose ends. Just call it off. Exactly. It's not worth the cost to try, and there's no evidence, there's no reason, no indication at all that the U.S. government could somehow figure out what the right thing to do is to make things over there better in any way at this point, other than just simply withdrawing.
Right. I completely agree with you, and I'll go even further. So I don't think you do this much on your show, if at all. Maybe you do. Correct me if I'm wrong. But to me, the other argument for total withdrawal from the Middle East is what's going on the ground among ordinary people who live there. And I'm not talking about so-called civil society. You listen to all these think tanks, liberal think tanks, talking about how wonderful civil society is in the Middle East. And usually they're talking about politicians and political parties and constitutions and rights and laws. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what ordinary people who live in the Middle East do with their lives most of the time. And it has usually very little to do with Islam and even less to do with going to war and terrorism. There is a huge amount of interest, especially in Iran and Tehran, in things like American popular culture. I mean, if you ask the typical 20-year-old person in Tehran what they spent the day thinking about, it was probably their new tattoo and not about, you know, the Quran. And this is, I mean, we have reports constantly about this, that Tehran, they basically have lost control of the youth in Iran. There is virtually, according to many, many reports, people who've been there, who've done these studies, there's very, very little interest in hardcore Islamism inside Iran among Iranians who are young. And the very good news is that more than half of the population of Iran is under 35. So to me, the days of the Ayatollahs are numbered. I mean, I don't see how that regime can last very long, given what's going on the ground. I mean, people there are way more Western than people understand and way less interested in what the Ayatollahs are peddling.
Well, and assuming
than we think.
Assuming that that's what Americans want, to be friends with the Iranians, and that's the interest, then the last thing we want to do is help those social forces that you're talking about. Because, of course, the number one talking point of the Iranian right is you guys are all a bunch of CIA stooges whenever anybody opposes them. So if we really, and think about it, in an even larger sense than that, the whole Middle East, what if we just hadn't been waging a war that has killed upwards of 2 million people over the last 15 years? And what if they'd done what Ron Paul said and done a letter of marque and reprisal, killed bin Laden, Zawahiri, and their 15 closest friends, and called the whole thing off and brought the troops home, and then just propagandized the world with freedom and tolerance after that?
Yes.
If that's what Western civilization really believes in, if that was the policy, just think how it would be. And by the way, so what's going on here then? This is all about Israel and the Israel lobby. And you look at Benjamin Netanyahu sitting here claiming that Iran, again, he's saying, is another Nazi Germany, which, except for that they don't have an army or an air force or a navy, other than some fiberglass speedboats. But other than that, though, they're Nazi Germany. You're just without the power or money right. And he says, listen, this is their ruthless commitment to impose tyranny and terror. That's the whole reason they get up in the morning, of course, and to murdering Jews, their commitment to murdering Jews. Well, that's funny because, there are 50,000 something Jews that live in Iran and love it and don't want to move to Israel. They would have a long time ago. And they're not afraid and they're not being murdered. They are obviously under the quote unquote control of the Iranian state there, but they are literally under its protection. They're not threatened by it at all. And Benjamin Netanyahu is simply a liar. He's simply trying to make people who know nothing be afraid so that he can get away with doing the wrong thing, starting a war. And Iran is not a threat to Israel at all. I mean, they can hit them with missiles, but again, they don't have any nukes. So they can put a 500-pound bomb on a missile or something. Yeah. That's strictly defensive. They had no offensive capability whatsoever. It's strictly a deterrent force.
So I probably disagree with you in a similar way about Israel and anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic sentiment in the Middle East, but that's kind of getting far from Yemen. We'll do that another time.
Well, no. I mean, this is 70% of America's beef with Iran is because that's what Israel wants.
Then let's do it now. Yeah. So, I mean, to my position on Israel, I think anti-war people kind of have, again, kind of not the right analysis. I think they sort of avoid a truth the truth that actually supports the anti-interventionist argument, which is that the establishment of the state of Israel did indeed displace lots of people, right? And so it makes sense that they would be fairly resentful of Israelis. And sometimes that resentment of Israelis can kind of merge into general anti-Semitism. Again,
well, how about the Israelis are constantly colonizing and murdering and torturing Palestinians? So it makes perfect sense, and it stands to reason that they would constantly demonize Iran in order to change the subject from their dishonesty and their murder on our dime, which helps provoke terrorist attacks against the United States, too.
Oh, sure. Yeah. To me, see, it's root and branch. I mean, to me, the very project of Zionism created all of this, right? There's no way to establish a Jewish homeland in this ocean of Arabs, right? I mean, how many million? There were 60 million or so Arabs at the time in 1948.
I disagree with that. I think what they can't get away with is what they're doing with the colonization of the rest of Palestine in Jerusalem, on the West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip. And that if they would just leave well enough alone and 67 borders alone and give independence and freedom to the Palestinians, that the rest of it could work itself out.
Do you know
instead,
about the debate?
They prefer a policy of domination and permanent threats and lies.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that because they have to, given the very project itself.
I don't think they have to, but anyway.
Well, yeah. So do you know about the debate within the Truman administration in 1947 and 1948, right, about whether to recognize the state of Israel? Do you know about this?
I know a bit about it. I haven't read John Judas's book, if that's what you mean.
Oh, it's amazing. Oh, it's amazing. You must go read this immediately. It's crucial. So there was a huge split within the Truman administration, and people like George Marshall were saying, no, we can't recognize this. This is ridiculous, the State of Israel thing. It's going to cause huge anti-American resentment. There's going to cause wars in the region. Anti-Semitism spike. That country will always be at war. He said the Marshall and the whole faction within the White House, and I'm talking about the top echelons of the foreign policy establishment, were saying, if we recognize this state, we and they will be in eternal war. There's no way, because he said there's 60 million Arabs and a tiny minority of Jews who will then have to say, to have a Jewish homeland, that certain Arabs, certain people, Arabs, cannot ever live here again. They can never re-enter that country. That's the basic logic of the State of Israel from the beginning. So this is why I get sort of frustrated with people who I think otherwise have the right politics about this. That to me is it's true. Like anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic feelings in the Middle East are real. They're pervasive, but they're also quite rational. They make perfect sense. Like, what else would happen establishing a religious state, a Jewish religious state, right there in the middle of that massive Arab population? It required the displacement of people, by the way, from pretty valuable property.
Yeah, but here's what you're ignoring.
Oceanfront.
What you're ignoring is time going by. And you're talking almost like, the page of history turns and the wind of time blows and all that. But instead, what happened was individual people made decisions. There was a great article by M.J. Rosenberg, who used to work at AIPAC long ago, where he talked about, 10 or 15 major foreign policy decisions that the Israelis had made over the years that had worked out terribly. And the way he tells the story is the peaceniks, and credible ones, not just protesters, but, prominent founding members of Zionism there, said, no, don't do that. That's going to cause bad consequences. And then they did it anyway. And then the next time they said, no, don't do that. And they kept making the right-wing choice. They kept making matters worse and worse, where they really didn't have to. They'd already won, and they could have left well enough alone. And it wouldn't be fair. I mean, the right of return would have been ultimately denied to most of the refugees, but at least they would have had the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and independence and freedom and the right to live, other than under a foreign country's military occupation all this time. And if you just look at the counterfactuals, about all of the choices that they've made to do, as Netanyahu has said, to make sure that Israel controls all of the territory from the river to the sea, despite the fact that there are 5 million Palestinians who live there, who have no political rights whatsoever in an apartheid state. Now, you could have Israel without that occupation. So I'm not saying yes, and then guaranteed everything would be fine. But how about it's a lot more likely that things would be a lot better if they hadn't occupied the West Bank and Gaza Strip and Jerusalem since 1967. Just like it would be a lot better if America quit backing sometimes the Shia and sometimes Al-Qaeda in these conflicts in the Middle East. It's not a panacea, but we're certainly making things worse now. And to say that, it obviously makes sense what you're saying, Marshall and them argued at the time, of course. But on the other hand, if you actually look at the history since then, the actual Israeli state is a fait accompli. It's been there. It's lasted more than half a century now. It's got a strong economy and a strong military. It's because of American bribery in part, but still they have figured out a way to have seemingly permanent peace with Jordan and Egypt. They were getting along fine with the Assad regime and helped pick a fight they didn't need to there. Obviously, they don't like Hezbollah, but Hezbollah is no offensive threat to them. So who's the threat? Hamas? Hamas, they're the trustees that run the Israelis' Gaza prison camp for them. Yeah. So you're saying there's 6 million Arabs. All the hordes are coming to push the Jews into the sea. But that's just not true.
Well, it was, I think, 60 million at the time. I don't know what it is now.
Sorry, yeah,
it's
whatever.
A lot of people. Well, again, so if you believe in blowback, you believe in blowback. I mean, right? This is a settler colonial state.
Blowback
right?
is not an iron law that says, and nothing will ever be okay again, and no one, don't even bother negotiating or coming to terms because there's always going to be bad consequences from before. I mean, the goal here is to try to make peace, right?
Sure. So, I mean, it's possible. It is really possible that the Palestinians could have just accepted this, oh, well, we'll never be able to be, residents or citizens of this piece of land where we lived for generations, right? And they may just sit quietly in their plot of desert somewhere outside of Israel and never want to fight. But that's not the case. It never has been the case. There's never, I don't think a year has gone by since the first Zionist settlers arrived there in the early 20th century, right? When there wasn't some violent reprisal by Palestinians in the area. And I'm saying it's not because they're evil, racially inferior Arabs. I'm saying because I probably would have done the same thing. So I am completely in that particular fight. I'm generally on their side, or at least not on their side, but I understand why that would happen, why they would feel that way, and why they would do what they've done. So I actually think the Likud analysis is correct, but what I say back to the Likud is, yeah, guys, that's exactly why I don't want to fund your little project. That's exactly why the United States should stop propping you up, because all you're doing is endangering yourselves, endangering Jews generally, and endangering me as an American taxpayer who's funding all of your nice fighter jets and bomber planes. Right. So the whole project to me, Scott, is the root. Zionism itself is the root of the blowback.
Well, and they're threatening to get you into a war with Iran, too.
Oh, yeah. And it's been a nothing but Marshall was right, wasn't he? He was right. It's been eternal war. That country is always at war. Always has been. But it has to be, is my argument, or nearly has to be. All right. So
it certainly has been. I'm not so certain of the necessity of it all. I'll try to find that thing by M.J. Rosenberg. Okay. I regret to inform you it was originally published at Media Matters, I think. For some reason, he had a job there writing for a while. But it was a really good thing about all these horrible decisions that absolutely people with the prominence to have been listened to told them so and not to do it and made things worse. And you can begin to imagine a parallel universe where it wasn't nearly so bad.
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I mean, I think that not every decision was necessary, of course, but I think that generally speaking, Israel has gone the way it had to go, beginning with the very logic of the project in 1948. I mean, I just don't see how else it had to end up as a walled off country. I mean, I don't see how else it could have survived. I mean, you just imagine, right? If some, I don't know, the Japanese, how about them, had come over here in the United States, in California, in 1941, as people said they might, and colonized Northern California, and then said, well, sorry, this is ours now, and we'll let some of you still live here, but most of you have to go. And by the way, no one who's ever lived here can ever come back and be residents or citizens of this country anymore. I mean, what would the response of Americans and Californians be to that, do you think? Right. I mean, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's settler colonialism, and it tends to usually result in people being very upset with you and wanting to destroy you and your colony. So,
all right. But so is there no qualitative difference than looking over the wall or over the fence and saying, yeah, that used to be my grandma's house versus I am today under the military occupation of a foreign government, and last night at 4:00 in the morning, they came into my house and kidnapped my little brother, and now they're torturing him? Because it sounds like, in other words, where in your analysis is there any differentiation between having 67 borders and having the ones that they have right now, where the Palestinians have no rights whatsoever, the ones who haven't been ethnically cleansed, the ones who are just occupied?
Sure.
What about, I mean, wouldn't things be, some incredible amount better if the occupation was over? And don't you think that at least then maybe they'd be in a position to try to make a permanent peace and a negotiation if they would, accept what you just said, that they're the ones who started it, they're the ones in the position of strength, and they're the ones who need to be reasonable and go ahead and back down and let the people have the West Bank?
So first of all, there's no way to know, and I just think it's doubtful that if they pulled back to the original borders, everything would be fine. And so what would happen, though, is if they did pull back to the original borders and there was sort of relative peace, or some Palestinians started throwing rocks at them again, they would then come to us once again and say, see, see, we need your help. We need all your money. We need your jets and your tanks and your bullets.
Well, that's worst case scenario.
So I would much rather our position be, sorry guys, no, the whole thing doesn't work. Sorry, we're not going to, right? Aren't we on
well, I don't know who
anti-war
said it.
side?
I don't know whose idea it was, but someone had said that, well, back after World War II, they should have given them West Germany. They should have said, come back from Palestine, the war's over, you get West Germany. And the Germans who don't like it, well, they can go live in the East.
Well, no.
Tough. At least that would have been fair. If anybody was collectively guilty and deserved to have their land taken away, it was the Germans, not the Palestinians.
Well, if you mean a safe space for Jews after World War II, we did give them that. It's called New York City, right? So, and Los Angeles. I mean, that's where they came, and they've been perfectly fine in those places ever since. Jews who emigrated to Israel, Palestine, have been unsafe the entire time. So this is my argument. It's like it's not even good for Jews. In fact, it just endangers Jews. The number of Jews who have been killed because of the existence of the state of Israel is in the tens of thousands.
Well, and that's what's ironic about all the Iran propaganda too, right? Is that, they pretend that Iran is this existential threat. At the same time, they're trying to gather all the world's Jews in Israel, but why gather them all in one place if Iran is going to nuke the place any day now? Don't you want to spread people out? I don't know. And I think you see there's been research about this where Israelis believing the hype about Iran and the danger of war with Iran and the danger of Iran to them in Israel cite that as a reason that they emigrate to the United States.
Exactly. So that's what we should be doing.
It's self-destructive, right? And the whole thing is a fairy tale anyway.
That's it.
Gareth Porter shows in his book, Manufactured Crisis, that the reason that, remember, after, you probably know this, after the Iranian Revolution, the Israelis stayed friends with the Iranians. Nothing changed there. And of course, when Ronald Reagan sold the Iranians missiles during Iran-Contra, he used the Israelis as the middlemen cutouts. Remember that? So the relationship really broke later. And it was when Yitzhak Rabin wanted to begin negotiating to give up the West Bank to be a Palestinian state, and I guess Gaza to be a Palestinian state. And in order to take pressure off him from the right, he said, look, everybody, Iran, the Iranian threat, as a political ploy to help him get away with granting the Palestinians independence. But then Likudnik, Netanyahuite branch, shot and killed Rabin. And then I forget if there was one between them or not, but once Netanyahu was in there, he picked up the Iran demonization and said, well, even Rabin said how bad Iran was. And of course, his demonization of Iran was also just political. It was based on nothing that was true about anything the Iranians were doing. But it was a great way to distract from the fact that he was going to never give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And now anytime anybody goes, wow, so the IDF breaks in the house in the middle of the night and they kidnap this little kid and they torture him. And they, oh, did you hear Iran is making a nuclear bomb? Yeah, your son might have to die in a war to prevent that.
Yeah. See, now, again, I don't think that serves the politics that we're trying to get to. I mean, it's true that Hezbollah is, of course, funded by Iran, right? Supported by Iran. There's no doubt that there's a direct link between the two. Okay, well, and they're right there on the border with Israel, and their stated goal is the elimination of the state of Israel.
Well, what do they have? A bunch of tanks? I mean, they have no offensive force. Come on.
Well, but they have certainly the motivation, don't they? And they have the numbers, don't they, to do something?
To just invade with infantry with rifles.
Well, but you can't just pretend. I mean, again, like if they're not an actual threat, then there is no blowback. And then you shouldn't have invaded
Lebanon and stayed in 1982 then. I mean, Hezbollah only came into existence to repel the Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon. Yeah, so, I really don't have a lot of crocodile tears even saved up for boohoo. I'm afraid that Hezbollah lives on my northern border, which means what? That they can keep the IDF out of Lebanon. That's what it means. Tough.
Yeah, no. I mean, again, zero sympathy from me. Okay, I'm not expressing any sympathy. I'm saying your whole project's fucked up. At least, like, you need to. You can. Good luck if you want to really, if you think that can work. But I do not want to fund it. I don't want my name on any of those bullets that you have to use.
Well, I hear you, but I think you can see too many facts or too much of the narrative to the war party about just how dire things are over there. Just makes them sound like they need our aid more than ever would be the conclusion most people would get hearing you, when I think it's really not true at all.
So here's the thing, Scott.
By themselves.
Here's the thing, Scott. I think that the analysis that you're putting forward has been the common analysis on the anti-war left and libertarian side for forever, right? For years and years and years. There's been a downplaying of the threat, basically a downplaying of the blowback. And what I'm saying is maybe we need a new analysis, because that analysis hasn't worked. And I'm not, I love everybody who's on the anti-war side, of course, but like, I just don't think it's been effective. I also don't think it's correct. But it certainly hasn't worked, right? People aren't convinced by this because next day they see some crazy Arab blow himself up. And what I'm saying is that Arab, there is something, this is part of blowback theory, right? There is something in that Arab's mind, and you know this, and you've said this 100,000 times. There is something in that Arab's mind, as crazy as he looks and blowing himself up, that is rational, a rational response to U.S. foreign policy, right?
Yeah, and I'm just saying none of these are Iran's guys. The last time Hezbollah did a suicide bombing was in 1999.
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
and honestly, I think if you go back and look at my coverage of Iran's role in Iraq War II, Iran's role in Iraq War III, and in the war in Syria, that you won't find me downplaying any of it. I do my best to cover that. My only thing is, I don't want to hear Americans crying about it, the American War Party crying about it, because it's all their fault. And
absolutely.
They're the ones who've done it all. And so I don't want to hear a bunch of scapegoating of Iran. But when it comes to covering Iranian-backed death squads in Iraq, killing Sunnis back in 2007, check the archives.
Yeah. When you say that, it reminds me, first of all, I agree with everything you just said. But, recently I've sort of been hanging around with particular people, political pundits who don't like anti-war types. And the common thing that you'll hear is, oh, well, they blame America for everything. And I was thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe I should look back at these things with a better, more critical eye. Let's look at all these. And I've been writing a book on the history of American foreign policy for the last 6 years. And I'm here to tell you, Scott Horton, that I still haven't found an instance where it wasn't America's fault.
I know.
I mean, it's amazing.
That's what I'm saying.
It's really amazing.
I know. Look, I was just having this talk with my friend last night. I go, look, responsibility is a quality. So the percentages don't have to add up perfect. Okay? Hitler and Himmler are still Hitler and Himmler, and they're responsible for their decisions. However, it's still all Woodrow Wilson's fault. All of world communism and everybody who died at the hands of world communism and everybody who died as part of the Cold War against world communism, it's all Woodrow Wilson's fault. All 60 million people who died in World War II, it's all Woodrow Wilson's fault. Now, are there an endless list of people who participated in all these events to be named as well? Yeah, but it was still all his fault.
Yeah, so
he was the one who committed the unforced error that knocked down all those dominoes and killed, I don't know how many, 150 million or 200 million people. And so it is all his fault, and that's perfectly fine to say.
Yeah, but you're actually being soft on the United States in terms of the Holocaust. Okay, so I don't know if I've told you this, but this is what I'm writing now, and in fact, I'm teaching a webinar on this on Wednesday. But so 2 facts about the Holocaust. One, and you probably know this, right? The United States, I think we did talk about this earlier. The United States totally sealed off the border to Jewish refugees all the way through the 1930s and all the way through the 1940s. And on top of that, during the war in 1942, when everybody knew the Holocaust was happening, the official position of the Roosevelt administration was to deny it. They were the first Holocaust deniers. So that's number one. So they locked the Jews out. They wouldn't allow the Jews in. And they told, by the way, all their Western allies to not allow Jewish immigrants either. So Jews had nowhere to go, number one. Number two is that Hitler, time and time again, and this is not even contested among European historians and even many American historians, time and time again stood on the stage of the Reichstag and said to the whole world, we want you to take our Jews. If you don't take them, we will kill them. If you don't take them and intervene militarily, we will definitely kill them. He said this over and over again, and Roosevelt just kept saying, nope, sorry, we're not going to take them, but we're going to go to war with you. So if you actually, again, so even when I looked at this question, and of course this is the most dangerous thing to say, but I actually have all the evidence, it's just stacked up. And European historians have been saying this for decades, and there's like a blackout in the United States on this. You cannot make this argument inside the United States, but German historians and British historians have been making this argument for decades because they have access to the research and the evidence, and they're not afraid to say it. Anyway, so yeah, it's all America's fault. But I mean, just what I say to people who question that is, give me an example. Give me an example right? Where it was really the other guy was and America didn't make this thing 10 times worse. Yes, there would have been a World War II, in my view. Yes, there were tens of thousands of people who most certainly would have died horribly at the hands of the Nazis. They did want to invade and colonize Poland and Western Russia, no doubt about it. But they had no other intentions beyond that. And they just wanted to make the Jews go away. They didn't actually want to kill them until the day after Pearl Harbor, until the United States intervened against them directly. So, yeah, I have still to this day not found an instance in which the United States, by its intervention, did not make the world much, much worse.
Yeah. Well, and of course, that's the number one reason invoked for American intervention in World War II was to stop the Holocaust, which, of course, it didn't stop at all.
No, it caused it. I mean, it guaranteed it. It didn't cause it, it guaranteed it. It made sure that it happened. That's my point.
And I'm not one to testify about how limited Hitler's aims were. I really don't know about that. But I certainly know that without American intervention in World War I, tilting the balance in favor of France and Britain the way that they did, and Russia, that it would not have, there could have never been the Treaty of Versailles and the impossible war reparations and all the things. That helped to set the stage for the rise of Nazism there.
Totally right about that. But it's a near consensus among historians that Hitler had no intentions beyond Poland and Western Russia. This is
if you say so. I'm not the World War II guy. Unfortunately.
No. This is near consensus among historians. I mean, there's hardly anybody who argues that he wanted some global empire, and he never wanted Western Europe until he was forced to take it, and he wasn't even taking it. It was a defensive move. But anyway, so let's.
By the way, Robert Stinnett, who wrote Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor, who had all the naval codes, found all the naval codes and all that stuff. The first time I interviewed him, way back in 2003, he told me that he had been researching American orders to the bomber pilots that no matter what, you are never to target the railways to the death camps. And they would have a list where, if there's cloud cover over your first target or your secondary target, then you go on down the list and see if you can bomb something on the way back to base or that kind of thing. But the railways to the death camps were always on the do not bomb no matter what list. And yet Robert Stinnett told me that under the Patriot Act, the documents that he had been examining were reclassified and hidden away.
Well, why would you bomb death camp when you can bomb a factory or an oil refinery? I mean, death camps aren't strategic. There's no strategic interest in saving those people. There's nothing going on there but killing.
Yeah, it's not. Although we're talking like 75 cents per bomb, right? So why not? When you're talking your fourth bomb target on the list, come on.
They did have bombs to spare. This is true.
Democrats, man, they can't be trusted.
Well, you know what Bob Dole said? Those Democrat wars, when asked about the history of the 20th century. Yeah, it's a bunch of Democrat wars. By the way, including Iraq, really, because the neocons are really Democrats. I mean, that's who they are. That's who they were. They're progressives. That's their ideology. The Democrats left them. They didn't leave the Democrats. But all right. Speaking of Democrats, so Yemen.
Let's talk about the news. Saleh's dead. The Houthis killed him.
Yeah, so this is going to extend the war, right? You're saying this is going to make it worse? It's going to give an excuse for escalation of this war by the Saudis and by Washington, is that right?
Yeah, so what happened is just in the past few days, he's started to try to deal with the Saudis and see if he could get his old job back. And I had been joking about this before. They're like, hey, split the difference there. If the Houthis can now get along with him, and the Saudis used to be able to get along with him for decades, then why not put him back on the throne there? But instead of splitting the difference and making a deal, he apparently tried to backstab the Houthis and just forsake them and try to ally with the Saudis. And so fighting broke out, and then the Saudis took Saleh's side in the fight in the capital city with airstrikes and all this. And the Houthis took revenge. They blew up the houses of his biggest supporters. And then this morning, the news was that he had been lynched. And so the Saleh-Houthi alliance is over. But so what about all those army divisions that were loyal to him and allied with the Houthis as of a week ago? Is this going to now be them and the Saudis against the Houthis? Are they going to stick with the Houthis against the Saudis and their puppets in the country? I have no idea. I mean, it seems like, seems like there's no ceasefire in sight, honestly. I don't know. So now I guess Trump and his generals can say, look, see the Houthis, they're a fucking lynch mob. We were right. We got to take care of them, I guess. I mean, I'm assuming that's how they're going to play it.
right? I mean, they need to,
Yeah, they'll say, look, see, we told you what barbarians the Houthis are, and that's why we have to double down in our support for those civilized Saudis instead.
Right. So, so
Al-Qaeda and ISIS are going to keep winning on the ground there because that's who we're fighting for. And, there's a great quote from a Mark Perry piece. I'm sorry, I don't have the title of it, but there's a Mark Perry piece at Politico magazine about the war in Yemen from about, I don't know, a year and a half ago or something. It's been going on a while. And it's a general, an Air Force general complains, I don't know how many stars, but still. And he complains that, John McCain says that, we're flying as Iran's Air Force in Iraq right now. But, and that's true. But here in Yemen, we're flying as Al-Qaeda's Air Force. And that's a direct quote of a U.S. currently serving U.S. Air Force general.
Well, wait a minute,
that's
buddy.
What we're doing. We're providing, in effect, air cover for the only real enemies of the American people on the planet, Al-Qaeda.
See, now I know you're a conspiracy theorist kook, because the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, Matthew Tuller, just recently stated publicly to Politico, I think, that their quote is nothing we can do about it. There's nothing we can do about our war. It's not our war. So I think, Scott, you need to answer to that right now.
Oh, my God, I can't believe it. I mean, well, the answer to that is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Los Angeles Times say otherwise. And every think tank in Washington, D.C.'s highest paid expert, too. How about that?
Yeah, what kind of I just think when I heard this, what kind of person would it take to take that job and to do that? I mean, to say something like that. I mean, he's in Yemen. He's the U.S. ambassador. To say that, there's nothing we can do about it. Sorry, it sucks. This is terrible. I hate this slaughter is awful. But our hands are tied. It's not our war.
Well, and speaking of the Washington Post, I can cite them as specifically saying, yes, here's some of the intelligence, work that we're doing with them to help the Saudis wage this war, et cetera, in the past. But they also have run pieces recently, and Adam Johnson at FAIR does a great job of keeping up with this, where they run these articles about the terrible cholera epidemic in Yemen, which is killing so many innocent people, especially babies. And it's kind of problematic that this is taking place in the context of the Saudi war with no mention of America's role at all in selling them weapons, in the refueling, in the coordination, in the anything. And 60 Minutes did an entire special on the cholera epidemic there. Again, no mention of America's role in this war for 2.5 years. That is, to me, crazy. That to me sounds like a lie about how blatant and bad it was under the USSR, that actually their propaganda was a little bit more sophisticated than that, right? That's just insane to think that they could do that on 60 Minutes, the TV show of record.
But wait a minute. Those F-15s that bombed all those people, killed 5 or 10,000, however many you want to count. Come on, those F-15s have Saudi colors, the Saudi flag on them. What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, of course, they're made in Texas. They're made in Fort Worth.
No, St. Louis. Aren't they?
St. Louis. Oh, it's the F-16s are made in Fort Worth. Sorry, you're right.
I think the F-15s
that the Saudis
use are the Boeing St. Louis plant. I think I looked it up. But yeah, totally American made, American funded, top to bottom. And so the Saudis have the third or fourth most powerful air force now, right? And it's not entirely, but the bulk of the fleet is U.S. made, right?
Sure. And I think, the actual operational capability of that Air Force is greatly in question. As I was saying, it's rumored that they even have American pilots sitting in the back seat helping these guys get to their targets and back home again.
Well, you have U.S. generals, I think, sort of stating publicly that they needed a lot of help in flying those things, right? And so they simply didn't have the pilots for all those F-15s.
It's a prestige job for a princeling, right? But that doesn't mean they're going to do real work.
Yeah, it's hard flying one of those, I would imagine. And they need, again, stands to reason, they need direct U.S. assistance in flying those bombing missions, don't they, to get the job done? And in fact, isn't that what happened early on, that they missed a bunch of targets and killed a bunch of civilians, and the Obama administration got all embarrassed and then had to send more advisors and more flight school people or whatever it took, right, to teach the Saudi pilots to do the job correctly? Well, I think that's what happened, right?
Well, that may be a part of the chronology, but they've been still hitting civilian targets this whole time. There's a great reporter named Matthew Akins who's done great work in Afghanistan as well. And he went and got a rubber dinghy and drove across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait there, or across the Red Sea from Djibouti, and snuck into the country about, I guess, a year ago now or more, a little bit more, and he reported from the northern cities up there, where the air war against the Houthi, base of power has been the worst. And he said it was just decimated, that they had just targeted the markets and the hospitals and the car dealership and all the factories and all the businesses and all the everything. They were clearly just waging a war to completely disrupt the entire way of life, the entire economy of the Yemeni people, and of course, slaughtering civilians all along as they did it.
And if the United States of America decided to stop that war, they could do it immediately, correct?
That's right. That's right. I
Correct.
mean, all Obama
Totally.
had to do was say, look, guys, you know what? Not this time. And that would have been it.
At any time, Obama or Trump, right?
That's
could
right.
Stop that war totally.
That's absolutely right.
Again, the tail does not wag the dog here. I think you agree with me on this, right? The United States runs the region, not Saudi Arabia.
America does a lot of what our satellites want us to do, or our government to do for them, to keep them happy so that they will do that. I mean, there is a lot of reciprocity in it. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump, despite all his lies about his personal bank account, he's the only literal trillionaire on earth right now. He's the emperor of the world state. That's what he really is. And temporarily anyway. And so, yes, absolutely. He could just tell the Saudis, you know what? I saw a picture on TV of a starving baby and I decided, okay, that's enough now. And then that would be it. That's all he has to do.
That's right.
He has total power to turn this thing off like a light switch.
Speaking of which, and Israel, have you ever read, or I don't think there's a audio recording of it, but there's a phenomenal speech by Henry Kissinger, I think in 1975, to sort of American Zionists. It was sort of like the elite Zion. It was kind of like the early AIPAC or pre-AIPAC organization. I think that's what it was. It was definitely Zionists who were in the United States. He gave this speech to them in which he says, you know what, guys? This is Henry Kissinger, a Holocaust refugee, right? He says, you know what? You don't get to call the shots. We call the shots. He says this directly to them. The Jews, by the way, you guys can be very self-destructive. So we're going to take charge here. You pretended for a little while that you wag the dog. No. We're the big dog. We're going to decide what your fate is and your destiny is. So don't get these grand ambitions in your little minds. He said this directly to the Zionists in 1975. Again, and so it's people on the anti-war side get confused about this as well and start to blame the Israeli lobby all the time for stuff. And it's
they have a lot of power, though.
They don't.
You know, what you're reminding me of is when George Bush Sr. said, I forget exactly how he phrased it, but more or less he let it be known that he would prefer that the Israelis elect a new prime minister now because he was over Yitzhak Shamir. And they said, okay, and held elections and changed the prime minister over there. But the American Israel lobby, they all turned on him and backed Bill Clinton. They did everything they could to get rid of George H.W. Bush, and they helped him lose.
But
Their
here's
friends
one thing
in the
I know
media and everybody else turned on him. And I was happy to see him go at the time. Not that I was happy to see Bill Clinton come in, but I never heard word one in the coverage that, Israel's friends in America have decided they don't like the Republicans anymore, and now they're going to tilt toward the Democrat. But that was what happened, and you can read all about that at mondoweiss.net. Just search Philip Weiss, 1L, Philip Weiss, and George H.W. Bush, and it'll come right up, I'm sure.
Great website, by the way, Mondo Weiss.
Yeah. They have a lot of power, and you know what it is? It's a matter of focus and determination and doing a lot of work. I mean, and they do break laws and cut corners and spy and all kinds of things. But what they mostly do is the hard work of lobbying in a democracy. And they work very hard to secure the interests of Israel. And, and Philip Weiss can show you this too. Norman Podhoretz and Irving Kristol, both two of the leading founders of the neoconservative movement, have both said in no uncertain terms that their entire interest in keeping America avowedly anti-communist and avowedly anti-whatever it is and avowedly engaged in the world is so that the American empire is available for use to protect Israel, just in case. That if the American people ever get over determining, being the policeman of the whole world, then when we need them, they might not be around. So we just better make sure they're always around.
It's all because Norman Podhoretz got beaten up by black kids in Brownsville, Brooklyn. It's true, man. I'm telling you. He didn't care about Israel until the 1960s. He decided to become Jew. He wasn't even really Jewish until then. Then all of a sudden he was Jewish, and then he looks over and sees these Black Panthers going to Palestine and gets pissed off about it. I'm telling you. But Yeah, so here's the thing I do know about Israel, though, and I think you would agree with me, and this kind of supports my analysis, which is that that state absolutely could not have survived and existed without U.S. patronage.
And that's certainly what Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz believe.
That's right. I agree with them. Again, their analysis is correct. Their politics is the opposite of mine. So these generals who are running the show now, because Trump clearly doesn't know anything about what's going on, nor has any desire to. It seems pretty clear now, right? The problem here, the danger here, and it's already being played out, is that from what I can tell, and I think you have said this, that these guys, Mattis in particular, are very angry at Iran, have deep-seated resentment. Was it Mattis who lost somebody?
No, it was
killed.
It was John Kelly, John Kelly's son. Oh, no, well, he wasn't killed by Iranians. He died in Afghanistan fighting the Taliban.
No, but Mattis, what was he had some specific personal reason to hate Iran, right?
I forget. You know what, Mark Perry, again, the great Mark Perry wrote an article about this, but I forget if it was just, maybe it was men that served under him. I don't think it was a family member, but it was, these guys carry a grudge over the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut in 1983.
That's what it was.
They carry a grudge against the Shiite militias who killed 500 of the 4,500 Americans who died in Iraq War II, approximately, who were, it was really the more sonorous, more nationalist militias that killed them, but Iran got the blame for all of that, even though really Iran was favoring the factions that America favored. Again, as I was saying, Dawa and Skiri.
So has Trump and his generals actually escalated the war or just sort of continued it?
Which war?
Yemen.
Oh, you know what? I don't think... Well, I'll tell you this. I think they have expanded the war. At the same time they're fighting for al-Qaeda. They have, I think, doubled down on the war against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, too. And there's a great journalist named Iona Craig who's written for The Intercept and a couple other places. And she has covered the collateral damage in these Joint Special Operations Command raids against suspected al-Qaeda fighters and leaders in the south of the country, which have succeeded in killing mostly innocent people. I don't know if they ever got anyone they were after. Iona Craig is, again, her name, and she's written great stuff there. So you have JSOC and CIA. I think maybe it may just be that there's more journalism about it now. I don't know the degree to which it's ramped up, but it's certainly going on. And then everywhere else, he said gloves off for CIA and JSOC at least, and Special Operations Command, lower first and second tier special forces, that you guys go wherever you want, do whatever you want. So they're tripling or quadrupling down in Somalia right now. They sent another 4,000 or 5,000 troops to Afghanistan, and they're going to try to stay in eastern Syria. They're saying, oh no, somehow Iranian power in Iraq has grown. We don't know if it's an exact direct result of our Iraq War II and Iraq War III. But anyway, here we are. And so now we have to stay to prevent Iran from being friends with Damascus, even though they always have been all this time. So
how do we stop this thing?
You tell me.
Well, I got some ideas.
So my short answer to your question is attack the right from the right. And I'm not a right-winger, but I need right-wingers. And I don't need you to become libertarians. I need you to become anti-war, and especially combat veterans, to say that, it's not that we've turned wimpy. It's just that we're smart. And all good, smart conservatives know better than to keep doing this bad stuff. And because nobody cares if the left wing is anti-war. What matters is in a Ron Paul way, when it's confusing for a minute, you're a right-wing Republican, patriotic Christian type, and you're very, very anti-war. That's, raises eyebrows and turns on light bulbs over people's heads, I think. So that's my long, short answer to that.
I agree. That's what happened with Syria, right? Several years ago, we got Breitbart on our side, and we got a lot of AM right-wing radio on our side. And I think if we did that now, because you're right, who cares what the left thinks? And the left doesn't care much either. If we actually get that right-wing and anti-war coalition going again, I think that'll actually speak to Trump directly, for one thing, but that'll really show that there's very little popular support for, really doing this stuff. So I think you're right. Let's do it.
In fact, let me say one more thing, and I'll just beg forgiveness from Margulies in a second. Calling any listeners to your show who are members of Veterans for Peace, that I think you guys got to change your name to Veterans Against the War. that the peace and the dove, it reminds people of Janis Joplin and hippies in Vietnam and a long time ago. But what we need is Veterans Against the War. That's a 21st century group that is focused on the war on terrorism and that is led by people who, no offense to you guys, because I love you and I need you, but and they need you, but people who are not liberals and leftists and who are not Vietnam War veterans, who are not 20th century era veterans, but who are 21st century guys who can say, I did 2 tours in Iraq War II, and I'm here to tell you why it's all wrong. That's what we need. And when they embrace, and I hate to say it, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not my personal opinion. I'm just saying the reality is the word peace sounds feminine and weak and utopian. It sounds like, oh yeah, well, everybody wishes we'd have peace someday. Who cares? But no, it's got to be Veterans Against the War, and we really mean it, and we know what we're talking about. See how different that sounds and how much more important and immediate and realistic it sounds, rather than like a hoped for goal of humanity one day or something like outlawing battery.
As a metrosexual man, I think you're right.
There you go. So you understand what I'm saying.
Man. Thank you very much.
I'm not saying I have, huge upper body strength myself. I'm just saying that the anti-war movement needs people like that as symbols. That's what I'm saying.
I do
it's
agree.
Very important.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. Against war. Yeah, I agree. Totally. Thanks for doing this, man. I'll let you go. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll do it again. Or maybe not. Hopefully do it again. Won't have to do it again, but I think we will. This was the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To sign up for the Renegade University webinars, visit thaddeusrussell.com/courses. To support the show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. Thanks for listening.